Okay, welcome to the second of our politics lectures as part of our continuing series for our inaugural lecture series at the Edinburgh Centre. I'd like to welcome Marco Biagi from the Scottish Parliament. He's a member of the Scottish National Party. That's platform is to push for full Scottish independence, and Marco will talk a little bit more about that. He's the youngest constituent MSP to ever get elected at the Scottish Parliament. So I think 31?
28 when I was elected.
28 when you were elected. So really remarkable, young, dynamic figure within the Scottish Parliament. He's I think 2 weeks ago you were sleeping rough on the streets of Edinburgh, kind of campaigning and just raising awareness of homelessness in Edinburgh. Marco's other kind of issue that he's currently pushing hard on is legislation for same-sex marriage in Scotland. And that was, I think, July. Was it around about July? It was tabled, and then that'll be moving forward. And Marco's working hard on that. So thank you, Marco.
Thank you. I'm told Barack Obama launched his healthcare initiative from an Arcadia University environment, perhaps something like this, perhaps not quite like this, but I hope to slightly stand in his footsteps tonight. I want to wish anybody watching, whether now or later, happy Thanksgiving, and I hope you're not indulging yourself too much on the pumpkin pie. I'm, as was said, Marco Biagi. I was elected last May in the Scottish Parliament elections. I've been told I need to get over calling myself a newly elected MSP because it has now been a year and a half, and I suppose that's most of an American congressman's term, so I should be thinking about myself being properly settled in and active at this stage. I think the first thing to say is that Marco Biagi is not a very Scottish name. It's not a stereotypically Scottish name, and I don't think there's any way to make it particularly traditionally Scottish. I come from a Scots-Italian background, and Scotland, like many countries in Europe, has had quite substantial exchanges of manpower people over the years. So I'm a third-generation immigrant, but it's something I think quite positive about the Scottish National Party that we have not just one Scots-Italian member of the Scottish Parliament, but three, and in fact, as with all other immigrant groups and descendants of immigrants, we've been very inclusive and very much able to take our place, not just in the Scottish National Party, but in political life in Scotland, and more of that later. I represent Edinburgh Central, that's the capital city, and the middle of the capital, but we're not talking a gigantic sprawling metropolis, we're talking a relatively small city, quite focused, and so my constituency is very cosmopolitan. It had been held by the Labour Party, who are now in opposition, the centre-left party, for about as long as it had existed, either in the Scottish Parliament or in the UK Parliament. And last year I was able to very narrowly, 237 votes narrowly, get across the finish line and win it for the first time for the Scottish National Party. And as has been said, I'm relatively young. I was the youngest person ever to win a constituency seat in the Scottish Parliament, and so it's been quite an experience and a learning curve being active in Scottish politics. Now, I'm from the Scottish National Party. We form the government of Scotland in the Scottish Parliament, and we have the largest representation at local level in the counties and cities throughout Scotland, but a much smaller presence in the UK Parliament. The Scottish National Party and Scottish politics, I know this isn't the first of the talks you've had on it, but Scottish politics is unusual in its main split, in that we essentially have two centre-left parties that compete for most of the votes and a small centre-right party that usually comes third or fourth. The Scottish National Party as well, it's very easy if you're just glancing across the whole of Europe to see all nationalist parties as the same. And there are very, very different parties that all come under the heading of national parties or nationalist parties. In fact, if you're going from a political philosophy standpoint, the number of ideologies that come under the heading of nationalist is probably broader than any other ism going in political science. In Scotland, we have very much exemplified what I think has come to be called over here civic nationalism rather than ethnic nationalism, an inclusive form that's based on a sense of community rather than any perceived sense of race or creed. So, for example, a parallel you might draw is with a university where it is undoubtedly a community, but it's a community that refreshes constantly, that welcomes new people, and that provides a clear access, and all of those who are part of the community are nonetheless welcomed in that community, as opposed to exclusive forms, the idea that in some parts of the world that you can have a party that defines what it is to be Basque or what it is to be Northern Italian, and that somehow this is something that the state can legislate for. We have always rooted our philosophy in the cause of self-determination, and the self-determination for Scotland is what we're seeking. And so in that vein, the Scottish National Party's broad perspective is very internationalist. We support greater international aid, participation in the world. One of our very first MPs, she won a by-election, or as Americans call them, a special election, in 1967 in the town of Hamilton. She said, "Stop the world, Scotland wants to get on." The point being that what we want is to join the councils of the world, not be separated from them, not to isolate, but to participate. And that's the kind of internationalist approach we've taken. And yes, we are called a nationalist party. We are included in lists of nationalist parties, but I would remind any observer that Gandhi was a nationalist, Nelson Mandela was a nationalist, and many people have been nationalists that have expressed positive visions for the future of their countries in ways that are inclusive to all. And in broad political terms, on the left-right spectrum, by American standards, the Scottish National Party is rather of the left, but I think that could be said about most parties anywhere in the continent of Europe. We stand in the mainstream of European social democracy. So we believe that, as a fundamental principle, that greater wealth is good and that greater equality is good as well, and that the two are compatible and can work together, and indeed in many ways assist each other. We support the welfare provision and access to high quality public services, and we have been quite firm in our action to tackle man-made climate change, trying to make Scotland a leader in the world. More, I think, on independence shortly. In Scottish politics, the divides are very unusual. As I said, there are the two centre-left parties, and while when I get up in Parliament, the worst insult I can say to a Labour member is that they're actually right-wing. I will accept that a lot of their voters, their traditions, their history is very much of the centre-left. Perhaps in recent years they haven't realised that quite as much as they had in previous years, but essentially we have two parties who are broadly from a centre-left point of view. So the question arises, how does that happen, and how do people decide who to vote for? And it is fair to say that the constitutional question has been the major dividing line in Scottish politics for the past 40 years and more. In Scotland, wealth is an issue, as it is in most countries, but both centre-left parties have a very strong appeal right through the social spectrum. You could perhaps characterise the Scottish National Party as being stronger amongst the rural low-income voters, Labour stronger amongst the urban low-income voters, but really there's not that much of a difference. Similarly, religion isn't a major factor in Scottish politics, although until as recently as the 1990s the Catholic vote was very strong for Labour. We are now in a very unusual situation where the SNP and Labour are essentially fighting over the same voters. so that we have evidence from election studies that last year in the Scottish Parliament elections, a third of the people that voted for us had voted Labour just 12 months before for the UK Parliament. That's a huge overlap, and it shows a very unusual political system that's quite hard to compete in sometimes. But independence really is the major issue right now that's affecting debate. We had a debate today in the Scottish Parliament on colleges, on how colleges were being funded. That's I suppose community colleges, to speak in American, and it finished being all about independence. I remember I was going to tweet this, I didn't, when Disney had bought over the Star Wars franchise. The tweet that I pulled back was, Disney buys Star Wars franchise, what's the referendum angle? Hashtag every Scottish news journalist. Because whatever happens in Scotland right now is analysed through the frame of the implications for independence. Whether that's a good thing or a bad thing remains to be seen. But there have been many issues. Clearly, we as a country are facing an ageing population, as with the rest of Europe, so the questions of how we continue to provide pensions and healthcare services that continually come under pressure of expectation and ageing are major concerns over the next 10, 20, 30 years. In Scotland, we have a very strong economic dependence on oil overall for our economy. The opponents of independence say that if we were independent, we would be basing our economy on oil, but it's the case whether we're independent or not that Scotland's economy is based on oil, and I would actually like to see us move away from that into cleaner, greener forms of energy where we have just the same level of advantage in Europe. And of course, all countries these days are facing the challenges of globalisation and competing. Right now, Scotland has as many universities in the world's top 200 as France by some league tables, but we're fully aware of the fact that in 20 or 30 years, most of those league tables are going to be full of Indian and Chinese universities that are receiving more and more money. And right now, we're quite fortunate. The OECD generally puts us at or near the top for our investment in university research. We get a lot of spin-offs from that, but we recognise that's an area where we can't rest on our laurels, and we're going to have more and more pressure in years to come. All of those are really looking ahead in a big way rather than in the near future. And what is really important in the near future, as I said, is the independence referendum. It's coming up in 2014 as a result of the SNP having won a majority in the last election in the Scottish Parliament, and we are setting that out for autumn of 2014. Now, my support for independence, as I said, comes from self-determination. Scotland is a country that has been around for 1200 years. You can look at maps of Europe from 1000 years ago and you can see Scotland there in a way you can't see countries that we're all familiar with, like Spain or Greece. At that point, there was still an entity on the maps marked the Roman Empire, centred on Byzantium. Scotland is a country that has a tremendous heritage. It goes back a great length of time. And I suppose the question really is, what defines a nation? What makes a nation? And what makes a nation deserve a state? I believe that, well, I think you can say that it's hard to define what a nation is, but you know it when you trip over it. And when you get to Scotland, when you see the national identity that is held here in Scotland, when people will respond to the annual or occasionally slightly less frequent Scottish social attitudes study, saying that they feel more Scottish than British, there is quite clearly a sense of national identity. When you tie that with the sense of history and the clear evidence of nationhood, you have what is undoubtedly a national community. Now, I don't say that, I accept that self-determination for a national community doesn't follow automatically, but I think prima facie, you have to argue against self-determination for a national community. And if you're deciding how the world is divided up, everyone is a nationalist unless they believe in one world government. Everything beyond that is a matter of degrees, where you draw the line. Do you have one country? Do you have 200 countries? Do you have 2,000 countries? And I would rather, for all that we do have the history, I would rather look at the currently existing community. So that instead of deciding the history, the borders based on an accident of history, lines on map, we'll decide it based on communities of interest, and Scotland is clearly a national community that fits that. And as I said before, our conception of nationalism is such that anyone who comes to live and work in Scotland and wishes to consider themselves Scottish is Scottish. The idea that you could go down a route of a government saying what is Scottish, well, frankly, leads to a government saying what is un-Scottish, and from there you're not very far away from the sound of jackboots. That's not a direction that Scottish nationalism or Welsh nationalism has ever gone. And I look, when you see you have a distinct national identity, there are then two other angles to consider. The economy, can you be viable? All the statistics are that Scotland can be viable for decades to come. And then we have the oil fiscal cliff of our own, which has to be navigated whether we're in the Union with the rest of the United Kingdom or not, and the political question. And it's really the political question that I think is at the forefront of the case for independence, because over the last 42 years, since 1970, Scotland has been governed at a UK level by the government we voted for just 18 years. We have repeatedly voted against Conservative governments, but had them nonetheless. We have repeatedly supported stronger Labour governments than we had, and received a more diluted version. In the north of England, clearly they have much the same concern. They vote Tory as well, but they have neither the national identity issue nor the economic viability, and so there is not a national question. But Scotland, as a historic nation, as one of Europe's great maritime nations, as one of the nations that has contributed tremendously to European civilization, more and more feels it is unjustified to be governed by governments that we didn't vote for. And so in 1997 there was a great unity, a very rare unity between the Labour Party and the SNP, as well as other parties, to establish a Scottish Parliament. And that was founded on the principle that Scottish solutions were the best way to tackle Scottish problems, and that we had distinct Scottish problems. And that gave us power over health, education, justice, transport, the environment, and gave us something that looked like a government, even if it didn't quite have all the powers of a normal government. And the question I would ask to anybody who has supported the Scottish Parliament, which is the overwhelming proportion of the Scottish public, is if you support the Scottish people having control at our level of health, of education, of transport, of justice, you recognise the national arguments for all of those, why not the economy, welfare and international affairs? And recent events, relatively recent events in Iraq, have shown the importance of Scotland having a distinct voice in international affairs, when Scotland really very strongly argued against participation in the Iraq War. And the people of Scotland at that time said that they wanted the Scottish Parliament to be able to decide whether Scottish troops went to Iraq, and that simply wasn't an option. And secondly, the problem, the great obscenity, I have to say, moral obscenity that is opposed by Scotland's churches, Scotland's trade unions, of nuclear weapons, which are based in Scotland. Every single one of the United Kingdom's nuclear weapons are based in Scotland. Scotland has felt, as a result of that, as a result of other decisions, that sometimes it is the place where things are put that nobody else wants, that nobody else will give a home to. And because the Scottish Government hasn't had the ability to say no, has not currently the ability to say no, there's a gap there where the majority of Scotland's people don't want either the nuclear weapons to be here, or for us to share in the £90 billion bill that is currently going through the Treasury and the Ministry of Defence to not just replace but upgrade these weapons. There's a very strong political consensus in Scotland that we could spend that on other things. And looking at those, for me, illustrates the clear foreign and defence angle. But I want to be part of a country that is a voice for good in the world, that can act as an honest broker in international agreements, in much the same way that Norway and Finland have. Finland hosted international arms reduction talks between the Eastern and Western blocs during the Cold War. Norway has been trusted as an honest broker in the Middle East for decades, because it clearly isn't being motivated by the fading dreams of empire, which very often is what is associated with the decisions of the United Kingdom Foreign and Commonwealth Office in the eyes of many countries around the world. And that's what I want. I want to stop the world and let Scotland get on, so that we can be that progressive, productive and positive voice in the councils of the world. And I would just quote something. It was written in a letter to the Washington Post in response to an editorial that criticised Scottish independence recently, and it was by an African American from Florida who works for the Scottish National Party in our office in the UK Parliament. And he said at the end of his letter, "Some 230 years ago, people in London would have read similar warnings about a small upstart country just across the Atlantic. As with Scotland today, that country was resource-rich and filled with potential, but was held back by a distant government in London. Somehow, that small country overcame the odds to become one of the most powerful nations in the world. I can't aspire to Scotland being powerful, but if our contribution to the world can be half that of the United States, since it achieved independence from the United Kingdom, I would be a very, very happy man." I'll take questions.
Thank you. When you talk about influence on global affairs, I think it's an argument I've heard put before, but one could argue that being part of a larger political unit, the United Kingdom, Scotland does have influence over world affairs through our representation in the UK Parliament. And you mentioned, well, we've had Conservative parliaments. That doesn't reflect the broader consensus of Scotland. However, those Conservative parties are aware that there's a large bloc in Scotland, and that tempers their policies. When Labour gets in, there's still maybe a more moderate Labour than perhaps reflects the Scottish mood, but it's still a Labour that has Scotland on its shoulder or looking over it. And when Scotland departs, that role that the United Kingdom plays would then get moderated. So a kind of a divided influence would be less strong than a united one. How would you kind of reply to that?
I'd say the UK certainly has influence in the world. If Scotland wasn't part of the UK would still be a £1 trillion economy. We're talking about a major economic bloc. The question is whether Scotland has influence over the United Kingdom. And I don't recognise that interpretation of Conservative governments that respond to Scotland. The Conservative government at UK level right now has 1 MP from 59 in Scotland. That's an incredibly distorted position. There is nothing that I have seen that suggests the Conservative Party is even really making a serious attempt to come back in Scotland anymore. Their majorities are found elsewhere, and they have been repeatedly rejected at the ballot box in Scotland. And as a result, they are acting in much the way that Scotland is. The two are drifting further and further apart. The question of whether we can influence the Labour Party, well, it was the Labour Party that was in government when we supported the US-led war in Iraq against popular feeling. And the history of the Labour Party, when it is in power, has always been a disappointment. It focuses its attention elsewhere. It focuses its attention on a median voter in England that it seeks to win over, despite the fact that every UK Labour government has had the most MPs in England and Wales. Every Labour government that has been elected would have been elected without Scotland. So I think where we do disagree, and we frequently do, it's better to have rather than a louder voice, a distinctive voice. Those are your two options. And if we were independent and the two countries agreed, then that would be two voices arguing for what we wanted rather than one. And I think actually in international circles, when two countries that have unusual histories or have evidence of political disagreement, when they come together to argue for something, it only makes that cause even stronger. And I've been very glad of some of the foreign policy efforts of the United Kingdom government. The work that Gordon Brown as Chancellor and as Prime Minister did on international development, on toxic debt in countries that could never afford to repay, that was all very welcome, and I think that independent Scotland would have backed it to the hilt and would have made that even stronger.
When you talk about weaning off of oil and kind of working that way, what do you see as being the substitute there? We have wind farms and things like that, but how, that's kind of big shoes to fill, how would you kind of...
Yes, it's definitely the case. Oil adds a huge amount to our economy in Scotland every year. Depending on the price of oil, it's between 10 and 20 billion in tax revenue, and you can almost double that in terms of GDP impact, so, and that's pounds, not dollars. So that's a major building block for our financial situation. With 2020 hindsight, I would have gone about it differently to how we have gone about it. Norway took a different approach in taking much of its revenue, its direct revenue, and setting it aside into essentially a national savings account, a national investment fund. Many of the Arab countries have done the same, and as a result, decades on from having discovered oil, they're now in a way living off the proceeds of that fund. It's actually, for Norway, it yields more money now per year than the oil revenue does. It's got to that scale. But hindsight's 2020. If we'd been independent in the 70s, we'd have been able to do that, which I think just shows the importance of next time, if we are lucky in a second natural lottery, that we have the ability to make the best use of it. But looking ahead, there's a real potential in green energy in Scotland. Just at the most basic level, we have, for generation purposes, 25% roughly estimated of the EU's offshore generation from wind and wave. Now, you can generate that energy and you can sell it abroad, and that's useful as far as it goes. The next step is to get manufacturing expertise, so that not only are you generating, but also you're building the things that other people are using to generate and that you're using to generate as well. The absolute top of the value chain, which we're trying to get to, is that we're doing the research to design the new equipment. And we have examples, for example, a Spanish company is citing its worldwide headquarters for renewable technology research in Scotland, and we're trying to win really that race in the way that Denmark got in early on onshore wind turbines and now manufactures a ridiculous proportion of all the wind turbines in the world and designs them. If we can get in there, then we really have a comparative advantage that we can take. And the great advantage of the oil to green energy transition is, in terms of the offshore infrastructure and getting energy from the sea, it's the same kind of engineering tasks, it's the same kind of maintenance, the same kind of construction that we already have. If anything, actually, the problem right now that I'm hearing from the companies that are working in the sector is that they'll train people up in the renewable energy technology on offshore wind turbines, and the oil companies will come along and take them away and be able to pay them double. So we still have to work on the transition, I'll get you that, but there's definite potential there. Yeah, a world capital.
There's one other factor: Donald Trump. Do you have a message for Donald? What's a good friend of Alex Salmond, and then the relationship soured a little.
Yeah. The great advantage of one of the great advantages of having a Scottish government, at least even just as a voice, is that we've been able to create networks to go out into the world to try and bring in companies and just have that leadership role. And one of the people we brought in was Donald Trump, and he came with £750 million, built a luxury golf development. He's built a luxury golf development. We have the construction, we have the tourism, very happy with that. He's now unhappy with a wind farm testing ground, a research site just off of his golf course. He's thrown a tantrum, and frankly, we're going ahead with the wind farm. That's the way of things. That's how politics works here. You actually do what you believe in, and we believe in green energy. And Donald Trump was invited to the Scottish Parliament to the Economy, Energy and Tourism Committee, which I now sit on, didn't sit on at the time. The report on what he said is out tomorrow after many months of deliberation alongside all the other evidence that was received. I'm probably not breaking any confidences of the Code of Conduct to say that his evidence is not taken very highly in that report. There were a lot more credible sources. If he doesn't want to invest further in Scotland, well, that's his decision.
I know a kind of personal interest, I alluded to this right at the beginning, was your interest in same-sex
Yes.
marriage. I think in America, 9 states have currently legalized same-sex marriage, although there's a federal kind of ban on, although courts are overturning that and saying that's unconstitutional. I know this is very recently in the summer, Scotland was just reviewing legislation to allow same-sex marriage. Would you like to kind of elaborate a bit on your role in this?
Yes, well, again, it shows that we are a forward-thinking party. Obviously, it's raised some disagreements in civil society. The Catholic Church is particularly put out about this. But as with all other things, our parliamentary group is very representative. There are 4 gay MSPs out of 65, and the first Muslim MSP and the first Muslim minister coming from our group. So again, a very diverse national party, perhaps national rather than nationalist is a better description of it, who knows. But yes, this has been an issue that has been quite controversial in Scotland, as it has been controversial just about everywhere it's come up. The Scottish Government had a consultation, 60,000 people from Scotland responded, 15,000 from elsewhere, giving their views. The public opinion in Scotland is that 60% roughly back equal marriage, about 25% are opposed, the rest are undecided. But when you drill down into the people that are particularly motivated, it's probably a lot more even. So MSPs across the Parliament are getting many letters about it, and it has to be said as well, I represent Edinburgh Central. Myself and my equivalent who represents the centre of Glasgow are probably getting more emails in favour between us than the other 71 constituencies in Scotland, because we simply represent where the greatest number of gay people have gathered and where there are just the most evidently cosmopolitan attitudes. But that said, there is an overall support for it. So, I mean, I would support it whether it was now when it's 3-1 in favour, or whether it was 10 years ago when we got civil unions, when it was about 50-50 in support, or indeed 10 years before. It's going to come to Parliament next spring. It's going to be a long process, and we're in an unusual situation where we will have a free vote on it in the Scottish Parliament in most of the parties. It's not very common in UK politics for there to be free votes, but when it comes to conscience issues, such as abortion, such as same-sex marriage, such as things that touch very firmly on religious faith, members are allowed generally to vote as they wish rather than coming under any party pressure. And I think that's maybe one of the ways that we've stopped religion becoming a very polarising political factor. So when abortion is discussed at the UK Parliament, centre-left MSPs, centre-left MPs and centre-right MPs will vote together. It's just how it's done. So I will be delighted when it happens. We are, as ever, going a little bit further than the rest of the UK. The rest of the UK is legalising same-sex marriage in civil surroundings only, so registry offices, but I suppose I don't know what the equivalent is in America. I'm not familiar enough with the politics, with the local procedure. I don't know, a county clerk or something registering your marriage, whereas in Scotland it will be those civil registrars, but also those religions that wish to perform ceremonies. Because a very important, if oft overlooked, part of the Scottish marriage debate is that we now have the Unitarians, the United Reformed Church, the Quakers, the liberal Jewish strand, which is the this side of the Atlantic's equivalent of Reform Judaism, and some Buddhist individual temples wanting to perform these same-sex marriages. And as I put it in Parliament, the one time I've spoken on it thus far, it really is a question of religious freedom. There are people who are religious who say never, there are people who are religious who say they want to perform same-sex marriage, and it's not for the state to say who is right there, but it's for the state to step back and say, if you're a Catholic Church, you won't be forced to, and if you're the Unitarians, you won't be forced not to, and leave it up to them. And that's what the bill will do, and I'm really looking forward to pressing the button as we do to pass votes. None of this roll call stuff, it's a lot faster. We can get all the votes done in a minute and a half on a good day.
I was thinking when you talked earlier about the prism of Scottish independence, I was thinking it was interesting that Scotland has had institutions that have been independent for so long, like our legal system, our education system, and you and our Church of Scotland.
Yes. Yes.
So we have had a kind of a distinct religious kind of identity.
Yes. I think distinct is an interesting word. I would use distinct rather than independent. But yes, we have ever since 1707 when.
So we just connect the little things just popped up.
Yes, ever since 1707 when we became the United Kingdom of Great Britain, and indeed it should be remembered, 1707 Scotland joined the UK. In 1801 Ireland joined the UK. In 1922 Ireland left the UK, most of it anyway, and this is really part of an evolutionary change in that regard. But yes, we have a distinct church in Scotland, we have a distinct education system, we have a distinct legal system. That's led to some very substantial divergences. I think the church has always been quite divergent. You know, a Calvinist Presbyterian church as opposed to an Anglican Episcopalian church, and there have been Catholic minorities in both countries. The legal system, there are some distinctions, but I mean, broadly it has changed surprisingly little in the last 300 years. But in the education system, in the last 13 years since devolution, we've seen a real divergence. Not in schools, where we've always had quite a level of distinctiveness, but the universities. We now have in England £9,000 per year tuition fees charged to undergraduate students. In Scotland we have zero.
For residents?
For Scottish residents. You know, it's much the same as for an American, a home state or an out-of-state tuition. If you're in Scotland and you're from Scotland, you get a favourable rate, and that is zero. Now, there was an attempt 13 years ago to introduce tuition fees in Scotland. There has been an argument that that was always going to be the way, that was just the direction of travel, it was irreversible, it was unstoppable, you just had to be quiet and live with it. And actually that's what a lot of student representatives said at that time. Those student representatives then went on to get jobs in the Labour Party. I'll let you draw your own conclusions from that. But in 2007 the SNP formed a government, and we said, no, we have a choice about this, and we've used powers of the Scottish Parliament, such as there are, to create a higher education system that's charging scheme is more in tune with Scottish political instincts, and that's an example of where we've split apart. And indeed, already, if you ask people what they like most about the UK, what they like most about Britain, while this will be difficult for an American audience perhaps to accept, the NHS, the National Health Service, or socialised medicine, as I've seen it described, is actually one of the great proud institutions, because it was formed straight after World War II. It was formed by from the solidarity that rich and poor alike had been, through bombing, rich and poor alike had been called up, and rich and poor alike should have access to the same healthcare. But when you look at the so-called one NHS now, the NHS in Scotland, governed by the Scottish Parliament, and only governed by the Scottish Parliament for the last 13 years, so we're not talking about 300 years of independence or distinctiveness as with the education system, has maintained very closely that original ethos, and in some ways has gone back in terms of access to prescription medicines to those founding principles, while the NHS that serves the rest of the United Kingdom, in particular England, has moved more towards a private insurance model with greater privatisation or turning into charitable non-profits of hospitals, greater competition between them, and more use of the private sector sort of as a single payer commissioning body. And that's a very unusual distinction a lot of people don't really recognise. And I think if people saw that more and saw that illustrated how we could defend those principles in those areas we don't control, the economy, tax, welfare and international affairs, if they would see quite clearly just how important being able to make those decisions here is.
I think for me there's a tension that you face there, because in a way these are areas where Scotland has exercised the power of its parliament, and as you say, I think the Scots are extremely happy with that, and they've enjoyed that. But then I suppose the challenge for you, and you made it right at the end there, was to say, well, we'd like similar control over those other areas and that's the argument you have to make.
It's back to the argument from arbitrariness for independence. Why should we have power in health when we can use it so well to meet the needs of the Scottish Parliament, but not have power over tax?
Yeah.
And as people see VAT going up, as they see other issues in terms of fuel tax, air passenger duty, where there are some very firm environmental arguments certainly going back and forward, but where there are concerns and where more the economic incentives are set up more for the economies that are strong on a UK-wide level rather than the businesses that are strong, the industries that are strong in Scotland, people will more and more ask, why can't we do that for ourselves? Because we've done it for ourselves so well in all these other areas. And that really is the core where I see our argument going for the next 2 years, to show where we have done things differently, we've done things better.
Good. I suppose the reply to that is to say, well, perhaps we could get those powers, but short of full independence. So I think there was this strange Devo Max or some kind of, and then I think there's a committee that's just advised the English, the Commons down in England, to immediately investigate potential changes to the Scottish Parliament. So even though it's not going to be an option put to the Scottish people in 2016. 2014, that they'll have a middle position, but then that's so that I suppose that's going to be in the back of people's minds, as they say. So it's not just the tax raising powers. It's that full that full kind of independence.
It's interesting because most of the research shows that if you gave people a vote tomorrow, they would go with what you might call Devolution Max, Devo Max for short, or Devo Plus as it's been called, as Devo Plus, indeed, as some people have called it. People will go for it. That's eroded slightly recently as the debate has gone on, but if you give people a sort of amorphous more powers option for Scotland, they will go for it. I think that's in the nature of being the middle option, independence, status quo, more powers. A lot of people will lump for the middle. You actually try and define what those are, and you start to get in a more interesting situation. And clearly, no one's actually managed to come together around a specific proposal on this. There have been attempts, and for all that we recognise it's a very strong position, and it might well cost us a yes vote in an independence referendum. We've been open to the idea that if people came forward, whether other political parties, civil society groups, with a coherent proposal, that we would be willing to put that to a multi-option referendum. We were told this was impossible, no one has come forward, there's been very strong opposition, so we're going to have a straight yes, no. There is a concern that I have, as not so much as somebody who was around then, because I wasn't around in 1979, but as somebody who studied it. That was when we had our last vote on a Scottish Parliament, or our first vote on the Scottish Parliament, I suppose, last one before the successful one. And back then, one of the things the Conservative Party said was, vote no, and we'll give you a better Parliament. Because that Parliament was proposed in 1979 was rather weak compared to what we have now. And the Conservatives said this, and the Conservatives at that point were still considered quite a Scottish party, a bit of a posh Scottish party, a bit of the landed aristocracy. That people would go out hunting and wear silly clothes and perhaps shoot grouse. But we're talking about a party that was still trusted in Scotland. Then they won, so a no vote happened, they won the election, and 18 years of Conservative government that became more and more divergent from what Scotland wanted, that treated Scotland with contempt, that tested a hated tax on us a year ahead of the rest of the UK, they never recovered from in Scotland. And that terrible missed opportunity that was the 79 referendum, I don't want to see happen again, because those 18 years would have been so much different, even with the toothless assembly that we were offered in 79, because there would have been a voice. It would have been a Labour voice, fair enough, but it would have been a Scottish voice, and it would have articulated that alternative vision. And perhaps we'd be at the independence referendum, perhaps we'd be independent now and we'd have had the independence referendum 20 years ago, who knows. But the worst thing is to be promised jam tomorrow when there's a question right there in front of people.
Okay, good. I've got one, I think, I've got one final question, and that's, okay, envision your dream. So on 2014, the yes votes come in, and Scotland votes for independence. What happens to the Scottish National Party the day after?
That's a good question, and a lot of people have asked it, and I tend to think that asking that is like trying to read tea leaves.
Would you join a Labour Party, a Scottish Labour Party? Would you join a...
I probably wouldn't make myself popular by saying this, but I think in the long term, it's unlikely that there's enough space in the market for two centre-left parties in any country. That said, the Republic of Ireland has arguably had two centre-right parties since independence, so anything is possible. I might foresee a Swedish-style situation evolving with one rather large centre-left party that tends to be the natural party of government, with a fragmented opposition, but also, you know, the little tents there, the Greens, the Liberals, the Christian Democrats even, which we don't have at the moment, the Conservatives. But while I could see that 20 years down the line after independence, I don't really see the transition from one to the other. I mean, I've thought about it, and the very nature of our political debate for the last 40 years has been such that the Labour and the SNP at an individual level find it very hard to talk to each other. You know, it is a disappointment about modern politics that you can go into the canteen in the Scottish Parliament and there are SNP tables, there are Labour tables, and there are Conservative tables. It's the same not just for the members but for the staff. It's the same in the pubs afterwards. And yes, we've formed coalitions with them. There's a very rare SNP Labour alliance that runs the City of Edinburgh Council, but I'm not sure they necessarily have coffee together of a morning, you know. So
the day the SNP ceases to exist.
Well, I might suggest that it might be the day when the Labour Party ceases to exist. It's a question of who is the senior partner when the two eventually come together. But I mean, in the short term, I wouldn't expect much to change, to be honest. A lot of people will have to ask themselves what they're doing. But the 2016 election will be interesting, not really for radical changes to the party system, but for the fact it will be the first election fought in Scotland where parties will have to come forward with plans, not just about how they're spending money, but how they're going to raise money. They'll have to come forward with foreign policies, and parties are going to have to come forward with ideas, right, there's a yes vote, on where they stand on nuclear weapons, on the Middle East, on engagement with China, economic questions of you know, who should pay taxes, of industrial strategy, and of how we run a welfare system. And the chance to have that debate, to be asked any question and to be able to give an answer, is really an opportunity, because one of the letters I got early in my time that really hurt me the most was from a pensioner. The pensioner was writing, asking me to do something about fuel prices, energy prices, the cost of heating homes, which has just soared. We now have, under the official definition of fuel poverty, a third of people in this country in fuel poverty because of the cost of heating your home is so much. And I replied with what we've done to provide home insulation, energy efficiency measures, all of this. And I said, we can't do anything about the energy companies, we can't do anything about the fuel prices, because we don't have the power. And she got back to me another letter which said, but we elected you with a majority we expect you to do something that's not good enough. And as a nationalist, as somebody who believes that a majority in the Scottish Parliament should be enough to deliver for the people of Scotland, as somebody who wants to be able to ensure that every pensioner in this country has their home heated in a way that doesn't force them to choose between heating and eating, that really struck a chord with me. And I want a yes vote so that I can go back to the Scottish Parliament, so that those majorities that get elected can deliver for not just that pensioner but everybody else who wants the Scottish Parliament to be able to solve Scotland's problems. And that's why I want us to be taking all the decisions affecting Scotland here in Scotland, or as some people call it, independence.
Thank you. Thank you, Marco.
Thank you.
Good.